Joining me today is Linh Do, an emerging voice in climate and social advocacy, both here in Australia and on the international stage. With a career spanning over a decade, Linh has worked with high school students right through to UN leaders and across many different geographies. Her breadth of experience has seen her engage with a myriad of voices within the climate movement and have conversations with so many different people. She believes diverse thought is essential to reaching solutions. Welcome, Linh, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I said you're an emerging voice, but actually, Linh, you've got a decade of experience on climate advocacy with different groups across different sectors. So in the climate debate, why do you think it's important for different voices to be properly represented?
I have long wondered, how long are you emerging until you have emerged? And is it better to be in that constant state of change? And I think all of that to say is, yes, I feel like I've been emerging for a while, but also that in this last decade, I really have been focused a lot on what does it mean to include different voices in the climate conversation. And I think some of that is honestly deeply personal, and then some of that is very strategic and what I actually think is needed in order for us to address the climate crisis. So I think the personal piece, I'll start with that, is that stories are really important. I think stories is actually what changes people's heads. Eventually you have to reach out to their heart before you can reach out to their mind. And I know that sounds a little bit cliched, but we all know that statistics just aren't good enough to get people across the line. You should obviously base things on fact, but at the same time, who are the people who are involved? What is the context? What are people's values? What are people feeling and experiencing? And for me, I came into climate actually from a science class in school, and it was really abstracted until I started to meet people that were both being impacted by climate change, but then also attempting to do something about it as well. But what I saw in the, I guess, like mainstream media, in some of the pop culture that we get represented to us, is that it's often people that wear business suits that get listened to, and whether that's because they're a scientist, a politician, or a business maker. And a decade ago, I was a smidgen younger, and I was none of those things. I don't think I had owned a suit at that point in time. And I wondered, where is the space for me in all of this? And being young, I had the benefit of really not knowing any better and just started to speak out about it. And I think had my voice at that time never really been heard, or had I never put my hand up saying I'm willing to do something, then I wouldn't have, had the last decade of working in climate.
I mean, the world is on a track towards 2050 now, but we can't leave that heavy lifting to 2040. We're going to make it happen in this decade. And we have seen a lot of the state governments and businesses, talk about green steel or renewable energy, hydrogen, and make big commitments. Are there other disruptive approaches that you think need to happen between now and the next COP to really get a breakthrough?
So much disruption is needed. I think in normal times, just change is fine. I'm okay with change in, the best of days, but it's really hard to look at the science, and obviously an IPCC report was released this year as well, and not think, okay, maybe change is no longer sufficient. And I think too often disruption is associated just with what businesses and tech companies and things that can be scaled to 1 billion users right away. But I don't actually think disruption is limited to that. For me, disruption is just people that are really willing to be audacious, bold, and maybe even radical, if that's a word that resonates, within the context in which they work. So what could be happening differently from civil society organizations that, similar to businesses, have a really standard way that we like to operate? What does it look like for academics? And of course, there's the role of business. Interestingly enough, my personal opinion is some of the disruption that needs to happen with business isn't necessarily new things, but it's actually maybe going back to some old things that have held together society. What does it look like if a business sector was willing to cooperate and not just be competitive? Obviously, there is a real advantage in being the first mover and whatever else, but there's still so much risk at the moment. And maybe some of that's because of the politicization of climate, particularly in Australia, where some of these companies that might want to decarbonize their entire supply chain and factor in, scope 1 through 3 emissions are unwilling to because none of their other competitors will, and suddenly they'll be losing money. what would it look like if, instead of waiting for government to say that actually we're going to mandate certain standards that therefore you'll all need to lift up to, that a pact of, the 5, 10 biggest companies within any one specific industry get together and say, actually, on this front, because of the climate crisis that we're currently in, what would it look like if we were to cooperate? I think that would be truly disruptive, because even as I share that idea with you, Dermot, I'm like, I don't think I can think of many examples where something like this has happened, but we're seeing at least individual companies start to move that way.
You've worked extensively with young climate activists, including in your role as the director at Melbourne University's Wattle Fellowship Program. Can you give me a sense, your observation, what are the common attributes that you're seeing in this next generation of leaders? And are they different from previous, the previous young climate campaigners?
I think there's a lot that I've observed that's really different. So I am, part of Generation Y. I like to think that I was there for, the founding of organisations such as the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, that creating of space for what does it look like for young people to care about climate change and to be actively talking about it. And maybe very optimistically 10, 15 years ago, we thought by just telling people that actually climate change is important and we should be doing something, that those those people who were in power would just listen, because that's the logic. And that was what we were taught in school, is that if you can present a really great argument that's sound and that's, logical, people will follow it. But clearly that hasn't necessarily happened. And I think as a result of that, young people, particularly those in Gen Z today, are just so much less willing to accept whatever the status quo happens to be. A report was released saying that 71% of those in Gen Z are willing to turn down job offers from companies or organisations that they don't think are doing enough to address climate change. And this, includes companies that aren't even working on climate change in a day-to-day, but whether that's, a fashion retailer, a supermarket chain, whatever it happens to be, the fact that young people who know that economically things are a little bit positioned in a way that's not ideal for young people at the moment, they're still willing to turn down their own personal economic prosperity and well-being to take a stand on the climate crisis. Some of the other things that I've really observed, in addition to being willing to really take quite bold and audacious stands and the personal sacrifices that honestly a decade ago, as I graduated university, I'm not sure how comfortable I would have been saying, yes, I am okay with not taking this job, even though I really have bills to pay and all of those sorts of things, is that I think young people these days, and some of these will sound like mass generalizations, but again, I guess having spent a lot of time with young people, I've noticed this in a broad sort of swarm and swath of them, is that young people might not have all of the answers yet, but in the same way that we don't necessarily have the answers either, they're just so much more comfortable with recognizing change.
So do you think, therefore, that our leaders are now starting to take more of that next generation's views into their decision making, or is there still a deafness, in high levels to the voices of young people?
Unfortunately, I do still think there's a bit of a deafness. One of the things that will always baffle me is in the last federal election, I learned what a franking credit was. I didn't realise franking was actually a word, and that was probably because I am part of a generation that has zero relationship with anything franked whatsoever. And despite the fact that in Australia, people can vote from the age of 18, in fact, it's compulsory to vote from the age of 18, young people are not treated as if they are citizens of this country that have a voice to play by where we cast our ballot, by the policy platforms that we're hoping parties will actually announce. Young people are just sort of treated as eventual taxpayers to help with ageing populations. And obviously it's really important that we address what ageing populations and their support and care looks like in Australia. But it's also pretty vital to recognise that in 2050, maybe there won't necessarily be a planet. And some people that are going and graduating from school right now, they're not worried about their franked credits or, what their future employment is going to be. They're literally wondering, is this planet going to be habitable or not? And that message is really still not cutting through. And I know that sounds obviously very critical of the government, but I think that is just the reality of today. For better or for worse, and it feels actually a little bit uncomfortable as someone who used to be slightly more radical to say this, companies are doing a much better job at listening to young people. I think companies are leading in a way that governments just aren't right now. And I think that's because companies realize that, well, if 71% of a generation is willing to say, no, thank you, I do not want this job, there is essentially no talent pipeline into any other industry, into any other sector, if companies don't at least clean up their act, even if government hasn't created a conducive policy environment for that.
So looking ahead, we've talked now about the current young climate leaders, yeah? But if we look ahead to the end of the decade of action in 2030, what do you think the next generation of climate leaders are going to look like?
I do think that in a decade's time, it will no longer be enough to just focus on climate change. And I think we're already starting to see this with some of the activists and young leaders that are working today, is that they are taking a truly more intersectional approach. A decade ago, I didn't know what the word intersectional was. And over the last decade, I've learned. And, you know, intersectionality is about, there is obviously an issue that you might happen to care about, but it is highly likely that it is interconnected to so many other issues, so many other geographies in the world. And that is showing up in the way of, what does gender justice look like in light of climate change? What does Indigenous reconciliation in Australia look like in light of climate change? And I think that these questions are only going to become larger and larger, especially as we start to move towards an economy that is net zero, is to then look at that piece of what is equity and what is justice in all of this. And I think some of these conversations are already starting to happen. Are they mainstream yet? Not quite, not in all circles, but in a decade's time, I think that will be the case. And I think the leaders that are coming will really represent that.
So after 10 years of your personal journey on climate advocacy, what's going to inspire you then to keep going for the next decade?
For me, I think I just really recognize that whilst there's nothing really pleasant about the climate crisis, I know that not everyone has the opportunity, whether because of skill, access, circumstance, or whatever else, to be able to align the thing that they're passionate about with the skills that they have, and doing so in a way that can contribute positively to the world. And it sounds really daggy to say all of that out loud, but I know that I'm one of the fortunate people that have been able to, you know, identify from a really young age that climate change is something that I care about. A world that is more equal, fair, and just for not just like me and people in my community, but the global world, is something that is pretty rare to be able to wake up every day and work on it. I don't think there's ever been a day, no matter how bleak the day was looking, that I didn't wake up still feeling really glad that at least for however many hours of that day, I'd get to focus on at least attempting to shift the dial. And until we have, I think I'm going to continue to keep emerging until we've solved this crisis.
I'm struck actually that, you know, there is a message in what you're saying there, in that you don't need to be a young person to be an emerging voice on climate change. You can be 16, you can be 66, you can be 97. You can always be an emerging voice on these issues. And so I think that's a very empowering message to really finish on, Lynn, that we all have a role to play. And no matter the age, your insights, I think, are a great help as people think through how they add their voice to what you and I believe is the critical issue of this whole century.
Very true. Thank you so much for having me, Dermot.
Thanks so much, Lynn.